In Gaza, pinned against the border with Egypt, there are well over 1 million desperate people wondering what will happen to them when Israel attacks. UNICEF says, and I quote, "Gaza is poised to witness an explosion in preventable child deaths, which would compound the already unbearable level of child deaths." At the United Nations, the United States, Israel's great supporter, says there must be a temporary ceasefire and that a major ground invasion in Rafah would result in more harm to civilians and have serious implications for regional peace and security. Here, a Labour Party Commons motion published this afternoon says it would risk catastrophic humanitarian consequences and must not take place. Prince William, heir to the throne, said today he wanted an end to the fighting as soon as possible, adding in an unusual political intervention, "There is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support for Gaza. It's critical that aid gets in and the hostages are released." Indeed, around the world, I think there has never been as broad a coalition against the plans of the State of Israel as there is right now over this possible future attack. And yet, so far, Tel Aviv seems unmoved. The former defense minister, member of the Netanyahu government, Benny Gantz, says that unless Hamas frees all hostages by March the 10th, an offensive will be launched in Rafah. The world holds its breath. This is happening now. So what do you think? Do you see this final battle in Gaza as a real moment of truth for Israel? Do you care either way what British politicians say? Let me know by emailing mar@lbc.co.uk or texting 84850. First, however, really important question, can America put effective pressure on Israel? I'm joined now by Frank Lowenstein, who is a special envoy on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations back in the time of President Obama. Mr. Lowenstein, very good to see you there. First of all, it's quite unusual what America has been saying. This is an abnormal level of public pressure on the Netanyahu government, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it really started last week with President Biden's comments that the war in Gaza was over the top, that too many innocent people were dying and starving, and it had to stop. That was a significant increase in the public pressure that President Biden is willing to exert. And then I think a continuation of that is what you saw at the United Nations today. We, of course, wound up vetoing the Algerian resolution, but we very much wanted to find common ground. And we were willing to say publicly that we strongly oppose this Rafah invasion and to signal to the Israelis that we're willing to take action at the UN to back up our word. So I think you're seeing an increase in the public pressure that the United States is willing to put on Israel.
And do you think what you could call almost the Rafah moment, where you've got so many people pinned into so small a space and the IDF prepared to attack them, does that sort of change the entire dynamics and the way this is being thought about in America?
Yeah, I think it brings a real sense of urgency to the president's statements. I think we've gotten a very strong message here in the United States from the Arab American community that they want a ceasefire. And this gives us at least the ability to say, yes, we support a ceasefire. It's a different kind of ceasefire, but it's certainly a step in the right direction. So I think you're seeing President Biden's domestic politics being reflected in his public position on this as well.
OK, biggest question of all, I suppose. Mr. Netanyahu observes what the United Nations is saying, observes what the third world is saying and Europe is saying and everybody else is saying, and he ignores it all. He does not care. Does America really have the power, have the influence to sway him?
Well, I think you're quite right. Netanyahu and the Israelis will do whatever they think is in their national security interest, really irrespective of what anybody, including the United States, thinks. That being said, we do have the tools to increase the pressure on the Israelis and change their calculus should we decide to use them. And I think today was a very significant indication that we are now willing to use tools we haven't been willing to use in the past.
And if President Biden thinks there's no real reaction from Tel Aviv, I'm going to have to open that toolbox, what does he do?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think we could start conditioning arms sales, which Congress has been clamoring to do to some degree. And then there's further action at the United Nations that remains available as a tool for the president. We can allow tougher and tougher resolutions to go through without vetoing them. I mean, we really don't like being as isolated as we are right now at the UN. We don't like issuing vetoes. We especially don't like issuing vetoes when it seems like the entire world is aligned against us. And you have Putin and Xi coming out and releasing statements saying the United States is all alone. We really want to avoid this scenario going forward. So I think you'll see some private pressure on the Israelis that translates into further action at the UN if they don't start heeding our advice.
Well, there's not much time because March the 10th is when they're suggesting the Israelis they will attack in Rafah. But we'll be watching very, very carefully. Mr. Lowenstein, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight. And that part of the equation probably matters more than any of the British political manoeuvring at Westminster. In Israel, hardly anybody cares what British political parties think. And although it won't change anything on the ground, the arguments in the Commons this week have become an unavoidable part of the story. The Scottish National Party has an amendment down tomorrow which calls for an immediate ceasefire. It wants to pile pressure on the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who has defended Israel's right to defend itself and whose party is badly divided over Gaza. At the weekend, the Scottish Labour conference essentially agreed with the SNP position, and today Labour has produced its own motion. It says, and again I quote because this is important, there should be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, which means an immediate stop to the fighting and a ceasefire that lasts and is observed by all sides, noting that Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence. Now, how different is that really from the SNP's shorter and blunter words on an immediate ceasefire? This is no time for playing politics. Should these two opposition parties not just agree that they basically agree? In the studio, I'm going to be speaking to David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, in a moment. But first, Stephen Flynn, the Westminster leader of the SNP. Stephen Flynn, very good to talk to you. I've looked at these two motions. I've read them both several times, and I honestly can't really see much of a difference. Your motion is shorter, theirs is wordier, there are nuances different, but the essence of it, you both condemn the Hamas attacks, you both say that Israel has got to go no further, you both express grief and sorrow about the civilian casualties. Where really is the difference?
It appears that on the face of it, we have which is perhaps unusual in Westminster, we have an outbreak of agreement, and from my perspective, that's really important because this has been about sending a clear message from Westminster to the international community, because our voice does matter within the international community as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as a nation which sells arms to Israel, that we believe in a ceasefire, we believe in an immediate ceasefire. And the fact that the Labour Party have come round to the position of the Scottish National Party, although with a few extra words, I think is a good thing. It's long overdue. There'll be many people who question why it's taken the best part of 3 or 4 months for the Labour Party to get to this position. But now that they have reached here, I think it has to be welcomed.
Well, they say that the situation on the ground has evolved. And of course, what's gone on in Rafah has really concentrated people's minds, because we can all kind of envisage and imagine that group of 1 million plus people trapped in a corner facing the Israeli army. Is that not the real reason that the Labour Party has moved?
Well, it wouldn't be for me to speculate as to why the Labour Party has moved its position, but I just would welcome the fact that they are now in broadly the same territory as the SNP. They are calling for that immediate ceasefire because 30,000 people have been killed, 70,000 people have been injured, and rightly, as you've pointed out, Rafah is normally home to 170,000 people. There's now 1.4 million people there who are about to be, are already under bombardment for the Israeli Defence Force, but we may well see a ground invasion as well. We cannot simply sit by and allow that to happen. And there is, as I say, a consensus in Westminster between ourselves and the Labour Party on this.
Well, a lot of the focus today and I think tomorrow will be on the SNP position and the Labour Party position as well. But what about the Conservative position? Because in the end, that's what matters more than anything else. How close do you think the Conservatives are moving, given what David Cameron has been saying recently, to calling for a ceasefire as well?
Well, of course, I've never been in any doubt that there's members of the Conservative Party who would like to see a ceasefire. Whether they would vote for one is an entirely different matter. Much like I was always of the view that there was members of the Labour Party who believed in a ceasefire. Some of them did vote for it, and perhaps some didn't. But you know, the opportunity will be there for everyone in Parliament tomorrow to vote for that ceasefire, to vote for the SNP motion. And I look forward to welcoming people from across the chamber to our position, just like Labour have.
So, as you know, your party has been accused of playing politics like this, kind of effectively trying to torture the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, over what is a difficult position. What would you say to people? This is party politics.
My focus throughout this has been upon making sure that the voices of the voiceless, the people in Palestine who have been under constant bombardment by the Israeli forces, who have been killed in their droves, who've had to watch their children die in front of them, that their voices is heard in Parliament. I've chosen to be that voice along with my colleagues in Parliament, and you know, that's been our driving mission. And of course...
And I've heard you talk about that a lot. Looking at the Labour motion, there is a lot more language about, in effect, the agonising dilemma that Israel is in than in your motion. There's an allusion to the importance of returning the hostages in your motion, that's for sure. But there's no talk about, as it were, really what happened on October the 7th. And some people would say there's not really an understanding of this appalling dilemma that Israel is in. If they stop fighting, if they pull back, Hamas returns, and another October the 7th could be not very far away.
So my starting point in all of this has been the protection of civilians, because ultimately it's civilians who've been at the wrong end of collective punishment from the Israeli forces. Now, where there is a difference between ourselves and the Labour Party in relation to our motion is not necessarily in relation to some of the words, and it's to do with, as I understand it, the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. I'm very firm in my view that the Palestinian people have been collectively punished by the Israeli government. I guess it's for the Labour Party to explain whether they agree or not. And if they don't agree, then they need to explain what preventing access to food, water, medicines, electricity, and indeed the ability to leave Palestine is if it's not collective punishment.
Well, luckily I have the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, in the studio with me. But for now, Stephen Flynn, thank you very much indeed. So, David, I have looked at your motion. I've read it several times. It's a long motion, and I've read the SNP's motion. And on the essence of the nub of the issue, I don't really see much of a difference.
Well, look, let me be clear that notwithstanding the importance of the vote in Parliament on Wednesday, and it would be good, I think, if Parliament can speak with one voice, and that's why we've crafted a motion that I think could attract the support of the government as well as support of the SNP. And I saw there some generosity towards the motion as it's now been crafted. Wouldn't it be great if we could speak with one voice? But let me just be clear about this. The SNP motion calls for an immediate ceasefire. It doesn't speak to that ceasefire being lasting. And therefore, our motion talks also about Palestinian recognition, which is an issue that the Labour Party has held dear for many years. It talks about that two-state solution, that horizon that we've got to get to. And in the end, it's politics and negotiation that will get us there. And it actually talks about the ICJ ruling, which Israel must comply with. So it's an important broader motion because this is the most complex of legal problems. But Keir Starmer and I have come out of Munich. We've spoken to our European colleagues. Keir met with Anthony Blinken. We've spoken to Israeli colleagues and others. And it's that gives us a motion that I hope the whole House can now get behind.
Now, because of the rather strange procedures of the House, what may very well happen tomorrow, as you know, is that the government will put down an amendment. They're saying they will. And that means your amendment may not be taken. If your amendment isn't put to the House and the SNP one is, then in that same spirit of generosity, I assume the Labour Party would vote for it.
No, well, look, let us wait to see what the Speaker determines, because the Speaker...
That's a complicated question. But you're not saying no. You're not saying that we will ignore the SNP motion.
I want us to do what is right in these circumstances. And I do...
As many people as possible speaking with one voice.
The motion that we have crafted does that. I have to say, if you look in detail at that SNP motion, there's a lot it leaves out.
Well, it's a much, with respect, it's a much shorter motion, and it says, like yours, there must be a ceasefire. It says, like yours, the hostages must be returned. It says, like yours, it expresses regret and grief about what's happened to so many civilians. Really, on the nub of it, the essence of it, there isn't a huge difference, I'd put to you.
Well, I'm afraid... I think that the fact that it does not mention October the 7th, the fact that it doesn't seem to indicate that a ceasefire requires both Hamas to lay down their arms as well as the Israelis to lay down their arms, because that is what a ceasefire is, according to the UN.
Of course. But is that not kind of obvious? Not...
Well, I'm not sure it is if the motion doesn't actually say that. And in the end, we must be guided in the British Labour Party by not cutting across. Neither the SNP or Labour are actually in the room. We're not in government, is the truth. So we aren't in the room. We have spent time speaking to colleagues who are, and we will not do anything that compromises the UK position in our own national interest and in the interest of the people in Gaza if we have the privilege of serving when there's an election later on this year.
I understand all of that, but I'm just trying to think of people watching this and listening to this, and some of them will be thinking that you're more concerned, if I can put it this way, with the optics of not wanting to be aligned with the SNP than of getting the maximum voice in the House of Commons that you can behind the simple notion that there must be a ceasefire.
Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. Look at the motion that we've crafted. The overwhelming majority of your listeners would agree with all that is in that motion. It's thorough.
I agree. I absolutely... We'll not have an argument about that.
Balanced.
I agree.
That is what the UK Parliament should be doing. This is too serious to play partisan politics about. Way too serious.
But... as I said, it is perfectly possible, and I think this is a bit ridiculous, but it is perfectly possible that your motion will not be selected tomorrow. And I come back to the simple fact that the House of Commons is going to be discussing whether or not there should be a ceasefire. 1.4 million people trapped in that corner of Rafah, observing the Israeli Defense Force, and Benny Gantz saying, we're coming after you if the hostages have not all been released by March the 10th. In that really, really serious situation, surely the Labour Party should vote, give the maximum number of votes to the simple idea of a ceasefire.
Let us be clear that this is more than just about emotion in the House of Commons. Wouldn't it be great if we can elevate the discussion to all of the issues, which is what our motion speaks to, be absolutely deadly serious about what's required of the UK Parliament at this moment with the seriousness of what's going on in Rafah, be balanced in our position, which is the position you would expect the UK to say. And if you look at what was put out by our allies in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada last week, our motion mirrors the deliberation that our closest allies have done and put out at the end of last week.
In the interest of being as balanced as is humanly possible, let me ask you about what Stephen Flynn was saying, that one of the terrible things that has happened here is that innocent Palestinian women and children, civilians of all kinds, have been the victims of collective punishment. And that's illegal. And that is something that your motion does not discuss. Do you think that they have been the victims of collective punishment or not?
Well, I qualified as a lawyer 30 years ago. I see those that have said that they believe that genocide is being committed. I've heard the calls that collective punishment is happening. Mm-hmm. Because I qualified as a lawyer, I understand and I believe in the rule of in the rules-based order and international law. That is a determination that must rightly be made by the ICJ or the ICC. It is not made by politicians in a studio.
Well, in a way, the cheap response to that is that your colleague Wes Streeting has said earlier today that he thinks international law may have been broken. And
I think it may well have been broken.
You think it may have been broken?
Of course. I think it may well have been broken. I've got very big concerns with some of what I've seen. But the judgment, the call for those phrases that are actually legal phrases at important terms must be made by an international court, not by politicians sitting in a studio.
What about the International Court of Justice saying that the possibility that Israel has committed genocide is plausible in their view? That is a very serious moment, is it not?
Well, the ICJ said that the case can go forward. That is not that it is plausible, that it's that the case should be considered, to be fair, legally, and that is right. And the important thing now is that Israel complies with what the ICJ asks, that the rhetoric that we're hearing from some politicians stops, that aid goes in, and we mention that, and that's why we're now calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. All of those things must be implemented now. Again, it's in our motion. It's not in the SNP motion.
At what point in all of this process did you come to the conclusion that an immediate ceasefire was now necessary? When and why?
We have been calling for the fighting to stop for weeks. I think if you look back on our statements, both mine and Keir Starmer's, Lisa Nandy's, John Healy's as our defence spokesman, it's been clear that we've been calling for that for weeks. We felt it was right that we get inside the room with those who are actually in the negotiations, and speaking to the Saudi foreign minister, the Qatari foreign minister, both of whom I've now met on a few occasions, speaking importantly to Anthony Blinken, we reached the judgment that we should call now for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Well, a really interesting conversation from both of you. Thank you both very much indeed, Stephen Flynn and David Lammy.